You'd think you'd get the mute thing after a year of Zooming. Hey, everybody, it's such a pleasure to host this session on energy demand. My name is Leslie Labruto, and I'm the Global Head of Energy at Acumen Fund. We are an early stage equity provider to social enterprises that are serving the poor. And I lead our energy work, and it's a really privileged position to be here and talk about mini grids. And just thank you to AMDA and Carbon Trust for hosting this event and bringing us together. So I want to talk about something that is a really big burning question for the sector, which is energy demand. And the only way mini grids can become viable is, of course, if we can drive up demand. Electrons are electrons, and that's great, but it's really what those electrons get used for that's actually going to not only make a difference financially for companies, but also from an impact perspective. So today we're here to talk about energy demand. And my big question that's burning on our minds at Acumen is, whose job is it to drive demand? And beyond the electricity, and again, integrating energy into people's lives, we need to talk about the productivity of that energy. And in particular, we have cold chain as a strategy. There's electric cooking is emerging as a strategy, solar irrigation pumps. We're starting to see appliances gain traction, but how do you even get an appliance connected to a mini grid? Whose job is that, and how do you actually drive up the demand associated with it? So that's what we're here to talk about. And I have four wonderfully esteemed colleagues who are going to be joining me today, who are experts in the field, leading enterprises, leading research, leading specific divisions within companies to really think about this problem. And they're going to share what they think is working, what they think isn't, and they're going to make some pretty provocative statements to certain policymakers and decision makers to help get the ball moving so that we can see mini grids not only be viable, but customers ultimately getting access to productive use appliances that they really need. So today I'll be joined by Bridget Menya. She's a research associate with the MEX program, that's Modern Energy Cooking Services. Bridget's expertise especially is with electric pressure cooking and really looking at how we can integrate cooking into the equation. So before I introduce others, Bridget, I'd love for you to just say hello and one thing that you're excited to talk about today.
Okay, hello everyone, and thank you for the opportunity to join this panel. So today I'm here to talk through the opportunities of electric cooking on mini grids and how that can enhance the viability and profitability of mini grids. So I'm excited to be here. Thank you all.
Thanks, Bridget. We're so happy to have you here. McKenna Herrera is a research lead for the Low Energy Inclusive Appliance, the LEA program hosted by CLASS. McKenna's had such deep experience in the appliance market. She's really the forward thinker on this in her field. So McKenna, welcome, and I'd love to hear what you're excited about as well today. I think you're muted, McKenna.
I'm sorry, I should also know better, Leslie, after all these years. Thank you so much for having me. And I guess I'll cut straight to the point. I'm excited to talk about appliances. They really are the end of the circle that completes that demand conversation. And so all things appliances I'm here for today.
Super, thanks McKenna for being here. Next we have Mikael Bruni. He's the Chief Commercial Officer at Inspira Farms. For those that don't know Inspira Farms, they're working on cold chain on a larger scale for B2B customers. And Mikael's joining us to really bring his expertise and longstanding knowledge with Inspira Farms to the table. Mikael, I'd love to know what you're excited for and want to dig into today.
Well, thank you and good afternoon. I think that's it's really how energy and post-harvest can really support unlocking and enabling the massive agricultural potential of for Africa, and looking forward as well to probably launch a couple of provocation to policymakers.
Super, Mikael. And lastly, we're joined by Ricardo Rodolfi. He's the CEO of Equatorial Power in Uganda. Ricardo always has something stimulating and exciting to say, so I'm excited to hear what his biggest and the thing he's most excited for to bring to the table today is.
Thanks, Leslie. Hi, everybody. Certainly excited to be here. I don't know about the most. It's always difficult to pick the biggest barrier, but certainly integrated business models and to tie on to Michele's tales, provocating the policymakers a little bit to accelerate. Accelerating being the key term. Thank you, Leslie.
Super. So I have 4 esteemed colleagues. I'm going to be pushing them on some pretty tough questions for about a half hour. And then we really want to hear from the folks in the room. I know other panels I've been on, it's been really engaging. People have had a ton of questions. So we do want to make space for that. I'm going to jump right in. So everybody talks about energy demand as a means to an end. And the big question in my mind is, what is the end? What are we actually solving for? And, what are each of you doing to help us get to that end? If we can't share a target or a vision of what we're solving for, well, then we're never going to get there as a group. So I guess in this one, I'd love to go around the horn, starting with you, McKenna, Papa, Ricardo, and then Michele, just for your 3 responses on this one. What is the end? What are we solving for here? And what is it gonna mean for your group to be a part of that?
Yeah, thanks, Leslie. I think the end means delivering energy services that people need, and that will lead to kind of good quality of life and good productive use of life. And I think we're talking about services like lighting, like cooking, you mentioned, processing. And I feel like to get to that end, mechanical equipment and appliances are really going to be the main vehicle to deliver those services. But it can't just be any equipment, right? It has to be good quality appliances. And the work we do under LEA, for example, is how to ensure that these good quality appliances are out there, appliances that are safe, that perform as expected, that are long lasting enough, that are easy to repair and maintain, many more of those quality criteria. And most importantly, that are affordable for people to acquire and maintain over a really long period of time. So, we run the Global Leap Awards where we try to discover best-in-class appliances. Then we carry out third-party testing on those appliances using a standardized test methods. And we publish that data on Verasol, which is, I think, really crucial for the sector to have that kind of third-party comparable data. We then do applied research on technologies, on markets, to understand the consumer, and most importantly, to evidence the impact of those appliances. And finally, we give grants that enable innovation. We give financing that kind of incentivizes the market to push harder and further, and basically trying to help the sector make and distribute good appliances and show that when you do that, then those good appliances do make people's lives better. And I think we're all kind of getting that is the main goal of what we're trying to do as a sector, right? Enable services and make people's lives better.
Ricardo, over to you.
Thanks, Leslie. To me, I would sum it up as I kind of mentioned as integration. I've said a number of times that although we're a mini grid developer in energy access, we don't really care about electrons. It's all about what those electrons do. So we started with business incubation as many other peers, and then we've taken that a little step further. And now we're really getting involved in value addition in agribusiness value chains, as well as e-mobility. And to me, integration sums it up because it's an integration of technology and business models, which eventually delivers service through infrastructure. That's what we're obsessed about, is delivering service. So that can take many evolutions, and I would add one point before I pass over. I don't want to be verbose, but this applies obviously for developers. I think it's the key for bankability, for mitigating demand risk, which is probably the biggest risk faced as mini grid developers. But it's also key and more obvious to national utilities. Right now, for the first time in a long time, most utilities are facing a situation where there's more demand, more supply than demand, right, in terms of energy, which is unprecedented in Africa. And therefore, productive use is no longer a kind of backwater problem for very difficult sites to get to. It's a national emergency. And I think you will find that increasingly this is reflected in thinking the boardrooms of donors, DFIs, but also local government. And I think that's an important moment for us to really push the agenda, Leslie.
It is, and you brought up something important about the use of obviously generating income. And Michele, I'd love your thoughts on this. And Bridget, what I'm holding up on you is because the cook stove is slightly different. So when we get there, I'll just sort of pause the question slightly differently to you. But Miguel, on your side with cold chain, what is the end?
Well, I would probably build on Ricardo and saying that first of all, it's really beyond the cold chain and what we do. It's enabling people to build their potential, but as well managing risks and uncertainty. We all see that in our day-to-day life with all the mechanics and electronics and lights and appliances or small and large industries that we use. I would say as well that there is a massive contribution to a continent that is really young and growing really quickly, and for which we need or that requires the generation of millions and millions of jobs that are as well of high quality. So for us, really, that value addition in agribusiness is enabling to reduce losses, to add value, and to capture the value that often is today lost, can help generate those opportunities, can help people to, especially in a continent that has a massive agricultural opportunity, to fulfill their potential.
And there's a bit of a holy grail, I'd say, with cold chain. In the conversations I've had, it seems that cold chain and irrigation are the two that are kind of primed and ready to go. So excited to dig into Inspira Farms' kind of experiences, what that's been for drawing down demand. So Bridget, the reason why I held off is because here we're talking about appliances that can increase revenue generation for customers, increase incomes, and there's a slight challenge with cooking products because it's really in the household. So the motivation isn't, I'm going to increase my income because I'm saving time on cooking. What is the end when it comes to modern energy cooking services and attaching those to both mini grids and on-grid situations and settings?
Yeah, thank you so much. So, in my opinion, I'm going to tie that into your question. By my opinion, what we are solving for, the end that we all talk about in all the big meetings we attend is about universal access to electricity and to modern energy cooking services. And I'm happy Ricardo mentioned something about, in some places, supply being abundant. Every time we talk about access issues, we always talk about the supply side, but increasingly we are beginning to see that the demand side challenges are huge. And I had some stats here that I picked up during my research saying that a lot of households are connected, are near the grid, but they are not connected. And even when they're connected, we all know the perennial problem about the low consumption levels and why productive use equipment is very important. But for the modern energy access cooking, modern energy cooking services program, we know that many households have electricity and still buy biomass fuels, such as charcoal and firewood for cooking. So for us, by promoting cooking with electricity, especially in grid and even off-grid settings and even on mini grids, we are not trying to increase demand. The demand is already there. We are actually saying that money used to purchase biomass fuels can be used to consume more electricity, which will increase demand for the mini grid and enhance their viability and profitability. So we have actually had some pilots with some mini grids, especially the latest one was with the pilot with PowerGen and with Access to Energy Institute, with who you had on your panel yesterday in Tanzania. And just by having some pilots of electric pressure cookers on about 100 households, the demand increased to about 30% on that particular mini grid. And again, if demand increases, then perhaps mini grids will be able to adjust their tariffs and it would be a lot cheaper. So I don't know if I've answered the question because I took a detour, but yes, this is what I'd like to say from my end.
I think it's all about making sure that we're defining productive use. Some people say, you know, productive use is only if there's income being generated, but in this case, the savings and the impacts just seem a bit different. And I just think it's important to recognize it and know that these can draw down power on mini grids and actually help improve their financial viability as well as helping customers. Okay, guys, so I want to know one thing. We only have a limited amount of time here. What is the greatest lever we can pull to drive energy demand? Is it regulation? Is that the lever that you pull? Is it technology? You know, let's get the costs down and make them more efficient. Is it financing? If only I had access to working capital, I could make this work. What is the one lever that you would say we need to pull? And Mikhail, I'm going to start with you on this one.
So, I mean, for me, one is for sure like shifting seriously to, you know, to a different type of vision on energy. And so, you know, the first point is having a serious drive to a carbon market and accounting for different type of energy. Maybe a couple of points on these. We often think about electrons, as Ricardo mentioned, and use Leslie as well, or kilowatt hours. Well, when we think about agriculture, and you know, kilocalories and kilowatt hours are basically exactly the same thing, and we need to think on the cold chain, on the post-harvest, as you know, a massive energy system in which there is a massive mismatch between the time the energy is produced and the demands of that energy. And so the post-harvest and the cold chain are the inverters and the batteries of that energy system. In addition to that, they generate a massive amount of rural jobs. So for me, really trying to understand that there is a big potential, that there's big losses, and what we're losing is energy. So having a vision of energy that goes much more, well beyond what are the kilowatt hours that can be measured within a switchboard, and really having a broader vision, and maybe finally accounting for the carbon that different type of sources and loads can generate and can manage, can be a massive lever to avoid going through the same mistakes that you know, that other regions or other development paths have taken. Thank you.
Ricardo, I know you had some thoughts here, specifically around subsidies and also around potential carbon financing. I'd love to hear kind of your thoughts on this and what you think is really needed here.
Thanks, Leslie. So Michele said some exciting stuff, and I'll be a little more boring. I mean, I won't dwell on subsidies too much, but I do think that we have to continuously and boringly remind everybody that this is going to be, because it's a heavily regulated sector, and partly still to a degree of public good, subsidies are essential, and they're essential to accelerate anything. And so that should be like a big eclipse moon, right? You know, moving back here at all times when I speak, because without subsidies, you know, we have portfolios for hundreds of mini grids that we cannot just, you know, we could do 3 at a time, and then 7, and then 6.5. Why? Because there's not enough subsidies, and that's the biggest hindrance. That said, I do want to say one more thing, which is key, right? Again, boring, and that's regulation. This is a heavily regulated sector. Even when it's deregulated in some countries, in some areas, it will become regulated soon. And when you unfortunately, I used to be a lawyer, so when you deal with regulators, you realize that you know, it's very simple. There's the law, and they apply that law, and they have to kind of balance. It's a very difficult job to have, being a regulator, because you need to be independent, you need to protect the consumer, protect the investor, and then you've got this political push to drive down the tariff. And the truth is that when you deal with a cost-reflective nature of a tariff, you've got to understand what those costs are. And the moment you start speaking about productive use, about demand stimulation, they're never counted. They will never be counted. So even if it's 10% of CapEx, that will be removed and will not be included in your tariff. So the biggest challenge that a utility, I mean, let's start from the basics, that a mini grid company has, is that cost will not be catered for. So somebody has to finance it, right? That's the problem. The second issue, if you put yourself in the shoes of a utility, that's just not in the DNA because there's zero incentive to even look at it. So the way I want you to look at this for a second is it's high risk and no one's going to pay for it. So why would you do it? But then on the other hand, you know you kind of need it. So all you do is, you do a little rain dance and hope that somebody else comes and does it. And that's literally where we stand today. So I think to be proactive, I've complained, to be proactive, I would say that such workshops, and perhaps I'd ask AMDA and why not Acumen and Energy Catalyst to organize workshops with regulators where we figure out how to help them factor in productive use, because this is far beyond the desirable. This is, as I said, it's a national emergency. If people don't consume power, there's a problem at the treasury level for deemed power of large IPP dams and solar, which is the case today. I don't know if you guys are following the problems KPLC is having, but they're bankrupt because of deemed energy. And part of that solution is household consumption, and a bigger part of it is industry. But anyway, never let a lawyer talk about regulation. So I'll pass the ball over to you again, and we'll let the debate roll.
Hey, we have to bring in our background perspectives to these things. It's a great point, right? We need a dose of realism. I think if we're all just bushy-tailed and optimistic and not really weighted in some experience of what's worked and what hasn't, what's the point, right? McKenna, on this question, I mean, one lever to pull, which one do you pull, right? You've seen appliances across the board. I think when we chatted about this, you had a really good point about finding demand versus driving demand. I'd love your thoughts on this one.
Yeah, I mean, I think Bridget also mentioned it just now that maybe the demand is already there and we need to find it and exploit it. And I think here technology can play a role. And I know, we mentioned regulation, we mentioned financing and technology, and now, Leslie, we are confusing. Maybe all these things are levers that we need to pull. But in terms of how technology can help us discover demand, we're seeing pilots of people using satellite mapping to discover where there's concentrated use of fossil fuel, for example, and then maybe going to discover that and electrifying it. So I think there are ways that we could really leverage technology, but not just at that scale of discovering the demand, but actually now meeting that demand and then slowly growing it. We've seen pilots where appliances have been implemented on mini grids, and then we've seen that spike in load that then levels out, and sometimes that's dropping off completely. And that just gives a small indication that the technology maybe isn't right. Is it rightly scaled for that application? Is it at the right efficiency that means that it's affordable over the long term? I think these are the questions we have to ask ourselves about how technology can really play a part to boost that demand, because it would be such a shame to do all the processes, get the regulations in place, put a mini grid on that side, get the right licenses, build it, get the customers, and then fall down at the last bit when we're trying to make them have enough energy services sustained over the long haul. And so I think that's going to be a really crucial point. Of course, coupled with finance, we can never forget about finance, because maybe then we could see that sustainable, the growth of demand being able to be sustained longer if there was some sort of injection of some kind of incentive or financing for the consumer. So a little bit about mostly technology, but of course with the appropriate financing.
Yeah, we could have a whole, I know there's been a session on financing, and we could probably dig into that kind of can of worms too, of the specific kinds of financing that are needed. Bridget, I only have 3 more questions total. One of them is for you, Bridget, and the next 2 I'm really excited to ask. There's a bunch of audience questions coming in that I'm really keen to dig into. I think these are great questions. Some about peak demand and just actually, managing some of the demand. So the next question I'm going to be asking is specifically about, is it the appliance company's job or the mini grid's job to be providing, the access to energy demand for customers? Before we get there, Bridget, there's been some critiques or people who've said, cooking with electricity on mini grids is going to be too expensive for households. People are used to basically the incumbent is free a lot of times when we're cooking on biomass stoves and whatnot. How do you tie this thread for the households to really be able to afford power if they're drawing down power to cook their, ugali or their rice in their electric pressure cooker? I feel like you're kind of the foremost expert on this. We'd love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, this is a very interesting question. And let me backtrack a bit on the level question. I was going to mention that I know Ricardo, I spoke about regulation, and then McKenna came in with technology. And I was going to actually speak about finance, because when it comes to clean cooking, we are not able to pricing the negative externalities that come as a result of cooking with biomass. We have the huge health implications, we have the damage to the environment, and then we also have the time that women and children and men spending collecting firewood. So just to tie that back to this question that you asked, it's a very interesting question because it's like a chicken and egg situation. You're thinking which one comes first. So say in some instance, tariffs on mini grids, because of the lower support that many actually receive compared to the grid, the tariffs are a lot higher and they do not incentivize cooking with electricity at all. So then the demand is low, and then the mini grid has to recover the tariffs, and then the tariffs are high. But again, if we promote cooking with electricity, there will be increased demand, and then perhaps the tariffs could be lower. So cooking with, in some instances, in some settings where the tariff is comparable to maybe grid settings or a lot better for families, it's not expensive at all. But we are aiming to work towards a point where the tariff could work for a lot of families. So it depends on the context. It's not there yet, but it will get there. I also, like I highlighted, the money is already there because the households are already purchasing fuels for cooking. And just to highlight some of the emerging opportunities, which is the falling costs of solar PV and battery technology, which means that the costs could go further down. We're also talking about the rising cost of biomass fuels. I was on a panel recently with some MPs in Ghana, and they spoke about the deforestation in their communities. There aren't going to be a lot of trees for charcoal anymore. So the price of charcoal and firewood is going to go high. So even so, this provides a better case for cooking with electricity, as even the technology brings the cost down. And we're talking about, from McKenna's even angle, we're talking about improvements in technology with energy efficient appliances like the EPCs that actually cut down the cost of cooking. I mean, heavy foods like beans in Kenya, matumbo, and all those things. So, and at the moment, it's becoming cost competitive, and it would be more affordable in the coming years. And of course, financing is going to play a very big role. MEX is actually working with key stakeholders on carbon financing, on RBF and social impact bonds. So for carbon financing, we are working with Gold Standard to develop the framework to streamline the process for accreditation of cookstove projects, so that it's a lot easier to monitor when people are using energy for cooking. For RBF, we are working with stakeholders like NDEV on RBF financing for clean cooking appliances, like the EPCs, and social impact bonds, like I spoke about. We are talking about the negative externalities, the impact on health, the impact on the environment, and the impact on time. And if we are able to monetize the positive impact of cooking with electricity and other clean options, we'll be able to provide better financing to support mini grids as they do this wonderful job of going into areas that many people wouldn't want to go into. So that would be me for now. Thank you.
Man, the threads we could pull on here. I hope people are taking notes. I mean, carbon finance, right? That's a whole nother kind of topic that can make this all viable for customers if there is that recognition that, you know, negative externalities, you know, dirty fuels kill more people than TB, you know, TB, malaria, and I think AIDS combined. So there's such an opportunity there to usher in and argue for a cleaner form of cooking. And thankfully, there's a lot of governments I know that are stepping with carbon credits, but still, it isn't reliable, it isn't dependable, and sometimes that's the issue as well. I'm going to ask this question. So again, I mentioned this early on. It's been on the minds of at Acumen for some time. if we want to see productive use scale, is it the mini grids companies' job to really encourage energy demand? Do mini grid companies also need to be financiers of appliances, procuring appliances and getting into the household of customers? Or do we need another entity, right, to provide asset financing and appliances, the Sears Roebuck of kind of Africa in this context? Or maybe there's another way, a third way. This to me is going to be the holy grail for how we scale productive use. And there's limited capital, limited room for experimentation. We want to kind of understand which route to go down and then really go for it if we have some hypothesis around this. McKenna, what do you think? What is the way that we're going to actually see appliance scale?
I want to disappoint you, Leslie, and so I think there is a third way. I think it doesn't have to be the mini grid company, and I actually don't think it's also going to be the appliance company, because the appliance companies are just not getting the sales volume to incentivize them to reach out to consumers on mini grids or even in other off-grid situations, contexts. And of course, at the beginning, it was the mini grids because they were closest to the consumer. That proximity gave them that trust, and they had the incentive. They needed the load. But I think it's time we evolved a bit into a third way, where we have a third-party asset financing company, someone who's an expert in sourcing, distributing, and financing some of these smaller scale, household and SME appliances and machinery. And those guys should form the partnerships that are needed with the mini grid companies to be able to align the incentives of growing the load, but also knowing the customers, having the trust of the customer and the presence of the ground that mini grids really have. But I think we need someone different. And we've been running a pilot with Enago in Uganda doing exactly this, trying to understand if this idea of a third-party financier is going to be what enables scale. And so far, our early insights are that, yeah, I think it could work. Given it's a small pilot, we need to expand that and see what that means with more and robust data. But we think it could work, especially coupled with business training and the kind of support that is on the ground provided by a partnership with a mini grid company. So a third way, and I'm really curious to hear what everybody else thinks.
Ricardo, does such a thing exist? From your experience, does this mythical company, is there a chance this can exist?
Well, thanks, Leslie. I mean, in full transparency, I mean, as a mini grid developer, as has been said, we're kind of forced to do this, right? We all accept that it's needed, and we do our best, and some companies do better than others. And in my experience, it's very difficult. That's the truth. And it's just a different job. And a few years ago, when we were looking at this, we thought, well, heck, there really should be a third-party company. We spoke to microfinance institutions. We spoke to banks. Nobody was really willing to do that. Everyone does their bit, and they're like, sure, if our bit and our geography fits, let's do it. But nobody's really looking at the wider problem. And there's, paradoxically enough, there's nobody doing it for the utility. And so at the time, I kind of put it to myself to try and think outside the box about this, and Energrow was sort of born, and it's evolved since, and we're extremely excited because now, Aaron Leopold, who everybody here knows, I hope, will be leading the charge at Energrow as of next week. So I think the key there was, again, zooming out. It's not just an appliance finance company to help mini grid developers. It's an appliance finance company to raise demand at the national level. And so you'll find that the biggest stakeholder is probably the utility, and then the plethora of mini grid companies that are growing. It's been very difficult nonetheless, because everything new takes time, but finally there's enough of a push that I for one am very confident that especially with Aaron on board now, that we should watch the space, because we're excited about what's to come. So because of my bias, I'll shut up there. But thanks, Leslie.
All right, Aaron and his team have some pretty big expectations and shoes to fill, but if they can crack this, be pretty key for unlocking productive use. Mikhail, we talked about in this specific question, another way, and you chatted before we started about asset financing. Again, which way do you think is the way to go? You run a company that's not a mini grid company, or you're part of one. On the commercial side, what's going to make this scale? Is it going to be the mini grids providing, connections to customers within Spirit Farms? Is Spirit Farms doing the work? What lies ahead?
Well, thank you. For us, it is fundamental, offering not only asset finance, but a mix of financial products that respond to the need of many customers of shifting more and more from CapEx to OpEx. So that idea of recurring revenues, of revenue sharing, of working with service providers or with the verticals on supply chain is something that for us it's happening. What is for us very important, providing, I think in this space, fairly large type of assets, meaning some of them are really in the order of 1,000+ square meters, let's say average value above the under 1,000 euros, is the alignments, the integration, the partnerships. How do we really able through the finance of bringing together different type of services. And I think that the opportunity is there because most of the assets we deploy have a break even, on high value crops of 2 years, medium value crops, we can be talking about 6.5 years. So, I mean, it is very interesting, but I do not think that, at least for our space, for cold chain, there are, facilities that are still willing and able to take the risk to bring these at scale. And when we talk about scale, I'm talking about thousands of units. Africa at the moment is losing 47% of average value on the ton sold, like for like, with other continents. And so we do believe that investment is worthwhile, and we need to think at scale, and we need to think about alliances and partnerships. We're going to keep providing that asset finance, but doing it with others can have really a massive geometric growth effect, and can as well be fun to test new models.
All right, so we are officially getting loads of audience questions, which means I want to make time for that. We'll save the 20 minutes I promised, but I have one closing question for you guys. It's the provocative one I was hoping to ask, and it is, if you could deliver one message to one financier policymaker, who would the message be to, and what would the message be? And I know some things are sensitive, so you can anonymize who that entity would be. But directionally, you get one shot, one message, kind of one wish to come true. What do you say? Bridget, we're going to start with you. Then we're going to go to Ricardo. Mikhail, you'll go after, and then McKenna, you'll bring us home.
Thank you, Leslie. Doesn't have to be just one of them.
I know.
Well,
if only we could sing if only we could blast a lot of messages. But in this case, one message, that you think could influence a lot of change.
Well, to policymakers, I would like to address. I'd like to say that mini grids should not be viewed as just a private business alone, but they should be embraced as a key stakeholder in development, taking into the consideration the immense role that mini grids will be playing in bridging the electricity access and modern energy cooking services gap. They should be considered as a special or a national infrastructure, and they should be given all the support that other conventional utilities are given. We have spoken about regulation, we have spoken about finance, and I think that often mini grids are placed on a different level, but they are going to the places that typically government utilities or grids are not able to go to. They are providing special services, and they should not be viewed as outsiders, but should be viewed as a key part of development and should be given the greatest support they can be given. That would be to the policymakers. So thank you.
Ricardo.
I promised Leslie I thought about just the one thing. I'm going to be sneaky and say I would throw it out there that donors need to talk to each other and do the UEF or other subsidy schemes. But the one most important message would be to policymakers. And I would, I imagine a room with sort of a bunch of presidents and maybe ministers. And my only question is, do you want to achieve universal access in your country or not? And it's as simple as that. Because if there's political will, We have 10, 20 years experience in how to make this work. We have Amda who's done a fantastic job and has all the info. I mean, there's anyone on this panel, not to mention probably most of the audience, has the roadmap clear in their mind of exactly how to do this. So there are a plethora of ways which this works today. So what I've found in too many countries, potentially all countries, is that the real political willingness is simply insufficient. And that's, hopefully there's no presidents listening to me right now. But the truth is, you need more political willingness to make this happen. And if you have that, the solutions are there and we can literally change. I mean, I'm sure AMDA members would flock to a country that had that right political willingness, and we'd probably achieve universal access in the next 5 to 10 years. So that to me is the biggest change.
Mikhail, one message. Let's do it.
I would like to, maybe embrace and build on what Bridget was saying. I mean, different technologies and different ways of doing things bring different type of impacts, both from a financial point of view and as well at a macro level. I do think that in most of the geographies where we work, a lot of the governments should equip themselves with more skills to write tenders and requests for proposals. If instead of asking for outcomes, they keep asking for, a 2000 cc diesel engine, that is the only type of technology that they will keep getting. So there is the need for multilateral donors and anyone in this space to support governments to equip themselves with the right skills to write the right tenders and requests for proposals to get new and efficient technologies into Africa. Otherwise, we're going to keep getting, really outdated technologies that do not serve, anyone's interests. Thank you.
I think I'll round off in saying yes to you. This, I think, to both, mostly to policymakers, but to financiers. Yes, you want to achieve universal energy access, but how do you want to achieve it? Do you want to achieve it coupled with developmental impact or not? Because if you do want to achieve it coupled with developmental impact, we need to think much harder about the assets, the business models, and all those kind of things that we're pushing and incentivizing. And one particular specific bugbear for me is the performance criteria of things or machinery and assets that are being included in incentive programs or in other big financial kind of packaged programs. Sometimes there is even no performance criteria. So how do you make sure that you get that impact that your universal energy access is meant to be kind of fulfilling? Because I think we don't want to be here in another decade after the decade of the mini-grids asking ourselves why we didn't achieve the impact because we didn't enable the right kind of stuff in the field.
Thanks, guys. Great final messages. We have a bunch of questions coming in. I'm going to be a little picky and choosy on these. There's a couple for Bridget and McKenna. McKenna, a question back to you. Why do you think solar irrigation has yet to take off in Africa? Very straightforward, direct question. What is the barrier there?
I think it's a circular problem. So the pump is expensive. You need to have the pump to get productivity, to make money, to afford the pump. And so we have to disrupt this circle. And I think one of the best ways we can disrupt that circle is making sure that consumers are getting the productivity gains that we assume that they're going to get from this pump, right? Whether it's in terms of connecting them to market so that they can actually sell the produce, whether it's in terms of enabling inputs, enabling extension services so that they can actually grow more, whether it's targeting the right pump to the right user, which sometimes isn't happening in the field. And there are very many technological savvy ways of doing this now and many being experimented with. So if we can help the consumer unlock the productivity, then they can afford the pump, and then you can sell more pumps, and you can grow them in this circle where you upgrade them from a smaller pump all the way to kind of, a productive, potentially commercial farmer. So I think that's the key we need to unlock specifically.
Super. Yeah, a lot of barriers there. I think that how do we actually make it work for farmers, whether it's affordability or, understanding how to actually drive up the income. That's kind of what we've seen as well. Bridget, question for you. How do we tackle the cultural issues related to cooking? And it is a good question, right? An electric pressure cooker or some of these electric appliances can't solve all the cooking needs. But again, there's a very deeply rooted way of doing things. So how do you make sure that this transition also is mindful of the way that, you know, communities have been cooking and operating for a very long time?
Thank you to whoever asked that question, because that is something that MEX is really focusing on. We are not going to prefer technologies that say that people should alter their way of cooking. We understand that cooking is a very cultural thing. So what we are doing is we have a lot of what we call cooking diary studies, trying to understand the way that people cook and how compatible that, let's say, electric pressure cookers are with the meals in the country. So say in Kenya, we've had a series of such studies where households cook with what they typically cook with, and they cook with the electric pressure cooker. And then we ask them, how do you find this way of cooking? Does the food taste the same? And we're actually increasingly finding that aside the great savings they make on the energy savings and the time savings, the food, they say, tastes the same. And it even tastes better on the EPCs. And actually, we are doing so on the behavioral side. We know that that's a huge challenge. So we are doing a lot of studies on that. At the moment, we actually we have a study on usability testing for electric pressure cookers, which we are doing in combination with CLASP in Kenya, trying to see how people view cooking with the pressure cooker. And we are beginning to, aside the way the food tastes, we are beginning to draw very key lessons. One of those that we've actually found is that most African families would love bigger sized electric pressure cookers because of the size of their families. So we are beginning to see, and in some instances, we have actually found that they would like their EPCs to be in Swahili if they could. So we are beginning to draw certain key lessons that we can pass on to manufacturers about how EPCs should be designed and how EPCs should work that would enhance their uptake. But yeah, we do acknowledge the behavioral challenge, and so far, the EPC studies that we have rolled out in a lot of households suggest that electric pressure cookers are very compatible with a lot of African cuisine. Thank you.
Thanks, Bridget. Question for you, Ricardo. How are you at Equatorial Power and you know, with your relationships in Uganda and the various firms that you're working with? How do you think about building, you know, consumer trust in really, you know, managing their transition to work with appliances? And I think the person who asked this question framed it well. As a rural customer, you know, who's trying to consume power, why would I buy a non-diesel based productive use appliance if I'm not convinced that the mini grid will be there to provide reliable power in 2 to 5 years? That's a really great nuanced question, and I'm sure you've dealt with this one head on.
Yeah, I'll try and dodge the mines in the minefield. That's a great question, by the way. So thank you, Leslie. I mean, I think that's a very real issue, right? So first of all, I'll say this: as Equatorial Power, we've evolved over the last 7 years. We've gone from, I think the whole sector has evolved from mini grids 1.0, which was your traditional 10 to 20 kilowatts, very expensive power. You plug in a nut grinder and the whole system goes off. Now you find increasingly larger and more resilient mini grids. We're about to commission a 600 kilowatt mini grid, right? We're looking at mini grids for towns. I mean, Nauru have built a 1.3 megawatt system, which is supplying. So there's mini grids 2.0. I think a lot of, from our side, we have no budget, but we should invest a little bit more in PR and communicate that the new mini grid, the mini grid ready for the decade of the mini grid, is a mini grid that provides much more electricity, that provides a quality of service. Because we cannot, on the one hand, say we're a solution if we're not at least a decent enough solution where people can use it, productive appliances. So that's the first point. The point is we need on our side to be very conscious of this. We are already doing things differently. However, we need to communicate this. We also need to educate our customers as to what is okay to use when. And that's not so much for the load. The load remains an issue, but oftentimes it's the quality of appliance and the way that they're connected, right? That sometimes can harm the grid. So that's another issue. One last point where we've suffered recently is technology. Very good to innovate. I think our company has probably been a little bit too gung-ho about innovation. We need to keep things simple. I mean, I am a big proponent of innovation. However, we should make a distinction between testing and rolling out, because I don't want our customers to suffer, the side effects of unproven technology. And we've had one such example, which will be resolved. But that's been probably our biggest problem in terms of customer complaints, has been a mini grid where we tried new technology, which I'm hopeful will work very well in the future, but so far needs troubleshooting. So I'll say that. Another issue, which I'll build on what Bridget said, and it's fundamental, and that's habit, right? Habit is fundamental to understanding the space, because you can't just go in to a place which hasn't had electricity ever and bring in this fancy new tech and expect that from the next day everybody does, fills in your data collection forms so you can write a nice report to class, or this is stuff that takes time. So as Bridget said, for clean cooking, this is both an issue and part of the solution, because people are not going to substitute away from coal 100% in a week, right? And to make irony out of this, I'm Italian. You're not going to convince an Italian that an electric oven pizza tastes the same as a wood fire pizza. So how can an Italian go to a village and tell them stop using charcoal? So this is to make a joke out of it, but the truth is that habit implies that time is required, right? So when you see it that way, all of a sudden you shouldn't imagine small mini grid, and because of the effort of MEX and CLASP, tomorrow everybody's cooking at night with electricity, right? It's going to be gradual, which I repeat is part of the solution, because we certainly, with what I said at the start, we do have mini grids which today can handle loads, especially as we grow them gradually. So just to circle back and close, I do think that is a fundamental issue that mini grid developers need to dispel between what was and what is and will be. And I think part of that is also consumer education as to what can be used when. But frankly, I have no issue in making promises as to the usability of our mini grids tomorrow morning. And I hope our CTO is listening to this. But yeah, thank you, Leslie.
Great response. Mikhail, I was wondering if you have any thoughts with that question too. I mean, has that ever been an issue? People are reluctant to use Inspire Farms technology and services because they're not sure about, the viability of electricity supply?
It has happened in the past. Probably it has been an issue until 2017, maybe even early 2018. Now we're finding that less and less. And it's more around how to find a solution, how to partner with, mini grids or other type of service providers to bring electricity to a site that might not have it, rather than the skepticism of installing in a place that doesn't have it. There is though the question of, especially in the past on systems that were isolated, that were off-grid, with batteries, thermal storage, and a lot of additional features on the CapEx, what happens to this investment if in 2 years, the grid is brought here? And I think there should be at least thinking about our loads that can go up to 200 kilowatts, a mechanism of thinking of how those mini grids can then be converted to grid size and connected to the national grid when it reaches locations that were previously not reached.
Thank you. Another question I want to ask to Bridget and Ricardo. A question about peak consumption. So this can be a big issue for mini grids. While Ricardo was a lawyer by training many moons ago, I was an engineer by training many moons ago. So I do understand that, right? Mini grids have a max capacity, and if we start loading up a bunch of appliances, especially electric, cooking as a great example, they're can be, 1200 watts all of a sudden, and if everyone's cooking at the same time, what happens? So, are we seeing a way to mitigate this? Ricardo, has this ever been an issue? Bridget, what is MEX thinking about in terms of how to mitigate this if it's 5 p.m. and everyone's EPCs go on and boom, the system goes down? Would love, Ricardo and Bridget, your thoughts on this.
Yeah, Ricardo, if it's okay, I'll go first. So one of the things that we have looked at is whether the mini grid can offer time of use tariffs. So if they cook in the evening, could you encourage them to cook in the day? And I acknowledge that some of them go to the farm, but the great thing about EPCs is that you can cook your food in the morning and it could still stay warm. And we are also doing research into battery supported e-cooking. So if they do cook, they come back, they can actually warm their food or stuff like that. But essentially demand side management and trying to shift that demand into the afternoons, where perhaps, like if it's the solar mini grid, there's a lot of power at that moment. So just understanding how the people cook and seeing if you can offer some incentives for them to shift the time they cook. And EPCs do very well. I have one at home. When I cook, it stays warm till I'm back, so I don't have to. It doesn't need you to tend to the cooking. You don't have to sit there watching it cook. So that is brilliant. So that demand side strategy could work, encouraging households to cook, not in the evenings, but maybe during the day. And there's ongoing research into battery supported e-cooking as well. So then not everybody is actually cooking at the same time. So for now, I'll let Ricardo take over.
No, great start, Bridget. I think, so there's 3 elements to my answer, Leslie. The first is building up on what Bridget said, customer education and interaction. And I think that's important, especially for cooking. That's fundamental. For other things, it's kind of hard to tell people, no, listen, don't turn this thing on now, use it, unless you incentivize it, which ties into the second issue, and that's tariff differentiation. Right? There's a lot of talk around that. Some companies are effectively doing it. I think we have all the hardware and software at our disposal, as well as in some countries, regulator education that allows us to apply time differential tariffs. And that's a great way to educate your client. Listen, in these 2 hours, it's more expensive. In these 2 hours, it's cheap. And that's what we have in Europe and America for our washing machines, for example. And the last point, which is perhaps the most important point, is system integration. And I think that a lot of developers and mini grid operators are thinking outside the box about how to make that work. I can speak for us. Equatorial Power spent a lot of time analyzing the whole landscape, zooming out. And what we found is that there's, as Michele said, I mean, I didn't know it was that bad. Michele, the chat after this, I mean, how much value is left on the ground? I'm sure that's left at every point, of the agricultural value chain, but certainly a lot of it is at the base, right? And if you think that 90% of value in a village is agricultural, then how much of that is waste, right? And what we've seen is that, for example, in islands we're operating in, people import ice. Think about that for a second, like tons and tons of ice, and half of that melts on the way. So we thought, okay, there's a low-hanging fruit. And we've developed that concept further. And what we have is a little agro-processing hub where we said, okay, everybody needs water, everybody needs some kind of cold storage or ice and other basic, can we provide that? And that's see it as a mini industrial park where it's pretty much our anchor demand. And so because that's such high demand, when we turn all the machines on, it's also in the context of demand response, it's also a whole lot of free capacity when we turn them off. And just like your clean cooking, what Bridget said, you can cook earlier in the day and it's still warm. Well, we can produce more ice earlier in the day and then turn it off. And now you have a bunch of excess capacity. So the way that Equatorial Power is dealing with this is we're building a bigger system, which mainly caters for this anchor demand that we own and operate. And we can turn it off in peak times. And that's just to throw out a pebble into the pond of developer creativity for you.
Super. Thanks so much, Ricardo. Well, we have 2 minutes left. We're out of time. I'm gonna stop us here. Any final statements that we want to make from the panel? Anything that was left unsaid? It's going to give you guys a moment. All right, silence is good. Silence is good. It means we got through it all. Up, Mikhail? No, everyone's going off mute now.
Yeah, we couldn't hear you, Leslie.
Oh, sorry. Any final comments or questions?
Well, one final comment
I'll
on
be
my
quick.
side. Oh, absolutely. Yeah. My final comment is on integration, and not only at the mini grid level, but with national utilities. We didn't speak about that, but the utility is by no means the big bad enemy. I think it's a potential huge ally for the sector. They need us. We can certainly need them or use them, and together we can accelerate energy access.
Great.
I'm just going to throw out the ideas around efficiency. I feel like a lot of the issues we've talked about here might be solved by efficiency. You know, that flattening out demand and all that. And I think we need to engage with that, with the concept of efficiency in the mini grid space, even as we're trying to build the load to make that sustainable.
Thanks, guys. Efficiency and business model integration. No one's the bad guy. Guys, really appreciate everyone's involvement, participation, your expertise. Thrilled to be here talking about energy demand. Hopefully, panelists walked away with at least one nugget they can take forward into their own work. And with that, we'll wrap up. Thank you for joining, and back to the main stage. Thanks, guys.